Joining me now with full analysis are Fox News medical contributor Dr. Nicole Saphier, former Bill Clinton advisor, but we forgive you, Doug Schoen, and Princeton University political scientist Lauren Wright. Doug, let me start with you, because I actually worked on the Clinton campaign in '92.
Sure.
So I'm going to, you might poke me back here, but we're looking at some things that look very familiar to us from 2016, and we know about the numbers then. We didn't have as much information necessarily about Joe Biden, but isn't the other issue, though, also the fact that it might not be Joe Biden? Wouldn't it be smart for Trump and for the American people to consider this might be a race that we don't expect?
Well, it's possible, Tammy, but everything I'm hearing publicly and privately tells me that Joe Biden wants to run and, as of this moment, will be the candidate. That being said, elections tend to be referenda on the incumbent. And Joe Biden's numbers, as I think you know, Tammy, are at or below 40% and below 35% on the economy. So Trump has a narrow lead in the Real Clear Politics averages, and the scenario you paint of him winning as the lesser of two evils is certainly possible given the administration's ratings and where we stand now.
Yeah, I personally don't see them as the lesser of two evils. A lot of Americans will, though, and you're going to make a decision. It's going to be based on, I think, who's going to do the best job. In this case, Lauren, great to see you. When we think about the science of a political campaign, Trump surprised everyone in 2016. He was not an unknown, but he was in this environment. He now is known, and we know what he accomplished. Joe Biden is not what he presented himself to be in 2020. He's clearly very different than what people expected. Would you think that that's going to affect people? Do people feel like maybe they were tricked when they voted in 2020?
Well, look, it was a big unknown in 2016, and that was Trump's benefit. In 2020, which I think is more relevant, Trump had all of the trappings of an incumbent president. He had all of those tools, even more visibility than when he ran as a celebrity, and he couldn't get the job done. And so I think Trump is perhaps the only Republican that Biden can soundly beat. And these other candidates, I just don't see getting to the threshold. RFK, while I would love to see him debate Biden as a political junkie, isn't anywhere near the threshold he'd need to be. And the DNC said they're not letting him on the debate stage. Marianne Williamson, Oprah's spiritual advisor, I don't think she's going to get it over the line. And we're forgetting the fact that Biden's own Vice President Harris is not even part of the conversation because she's very vulnerable and very unpopular. And so who would it be? Someone he either beat in 2020? I don't know. But Trump's the weakest person he's got. That's who Democrats are sincerely hoping will be the nominee and likely will be, Tammy.
Dr. Nicole, I think that they also thought he was particularly weak in 2016. He wasn't taken seriously. There's always been an underestimation of him. The difference now, I think, though, is that Joe Biden hid in the basement. We were not aware necessarily of his cognitive situation. We now have seen that every day, at least when he's out and about. Do you think that's a factor that Americans are looking at with the president, which we really, he literally was hidden away from us? I don't think that's going to work this time. And I think the American people are concerned, and even the Democrats, I think a majority don't want him to run again. Will that be a factor?
Well, Tammy, listen, it was an easy campaign from his basement during the pandemic, and it seems to be he's doing the same method now. We're not seeing him much, and that's one reason why Donald Trump continues to poll so well, is because he is always up front. He takes questions from the media, and he's really an open book. Now, listen, there are a lot of presidents preceding President Biden who had health maladies that, people worried would impact whether they could be president or not, and obviously they did fine. But the growing concern when it comes to President Biden is whether or not he has the cognitive or mental ability to have another 4 years as commander-in-chief. And, some of the most common signs of cognitive decline are losing direction. Maybe he just doesn't know which way to go off stage, but also, losing words when he's speaking and forgetting certain events. I mean, who could forget last year when he forgot Congresswoman Jackie Walorski had passed when he was looking for her in the audience just a few weeks after her death? Now, none of this confirms a diagnosis of cognitive decline, but there are certainly questions to be asked. And the Alzheimer's Association, they polled about all of the primary care physicians. 97% say that you have to have cognitive evaluation starting at the age of 65. Yet here we are with President Biden, and in his physical exams, we don't have complete cognitive assessments. I think if he wants the votes from Americans, it will be prudent for the White House and President Biden to prove not only his physical fitness, but also his mental fitness, because that seems to be where the concern is. Right.
And, Doug, we see also there in that list when it comes to Trump's issues, he's over 50%. You've got DeSantis, I think, around 22%. People expected more from DeSantis. It's interesting that this is what the campaigns are for, right? Is you find out what people are made of, whether or not they know who the Uyghurs are, right? Questions have to be asked. There are debates. Is there any sign that DeSantis is having any kind of an impact, or that his numbers might be moving when it comes to the end result and who would be the nominee? No?
There is no sign of him moving. Indeed, the opposite. He seems mired at about 21 or 22. He's going to spend an enormous amount, Tammy, in Iowa and New Hampshire, 2 states where he polls relatively better than he does nationally, but still trails former President Trump by 20 points. But these are tough margins to make up, both in those 2 first primary states and nationally. Donald Trump is the odds-on favorite as we sit here today.
Yeah, I think, and thank you all of you for tonight, but of course, but just before Independence Day. It's interesting that, the Democrats, of course, don't want to have any debate. And Lauren, I'll give you the last word here. And yet we do have this huge lineup in the Republican end. Do you think all those people being on the Republican competing for the nomination is going to have any impact on Trump's numbers?
Oh, it'll help him. I mean, every time a Republican jumps into this race, the field gets larger, more difficult to distinguish among, and that helps Trump. But look, I don't think his numbers have changed for many months now. Despite these indictments, he's kept this core level of support. It's been in the 50s since before the Stormy Daniels indictment, then the documents indictment. These are people who don't see a clear alternative and know and love Trump already. It's not necessarily a sign that his legal troubles are helping and energizing. It's just a sign that he's the figurehead of the party, and they have not provided an alternative. As you said, Ron DeSantis has not turned out to be that clear front runner.
Right. All right. All of you, thank you very much. It's going to be an interesting 18 months leading into this. At the same time, I have to say that Americans, he was kind of elected, Trump was, on the issue of a 2-tiered system of justice. And now it seems to be playing out in front of people. But we've got a lot of time to figure it out.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.